Trolls. A troll is a person who intentionally makes fun of a person or a thing in order to provoke a reaction either from their target or an audience. Trolls are most associated with the internet and YouTube comment sections, but they've been around a long time, well before the internet, or even before electricity. And a good troll knows their subject matter well. They go beyond a simple joke. There are plenty of jokes in music, even music that is hundreds of years old. Haydn's music is a great example. His surprise symphony was meant to wake up rude audience members falling asleep during his concerts. In the second movement of his 94th symphony, he puts the audience to sleep with a lullaby melody that sounds almost like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and then shocks them awake with a tutti fortissimo chord. Or his Farewell Symphony, where he instructs the overworked orchestra to leave the stage one by one in protest until just 2 violins remain. This was done to poke fun at his employer, who was in the audience, who had denied his orchestra time off to spend time with their families. Mozart, who was one of Haydn's contemporaries, took many inspirations from Haydn, including his fondness of humor, though probably not as annoying as he was portrayed in the movie Amadeus. It was clear that he liked to laugh. This can be seen in many of his letters and some of his less serious musical pieces. He seemed to have a fondness of the scatological variety. But Mozart, being the bold composer that he was, wanted to take the idea of a joke in music and turn it up to 11. So he wrote an entire piece that was a joke, Ein musikalischer Spaß, which roughly translates to a musical joke or some musical fun. But instead of just poking fun at the audience, he turns his impressive levels of trolling on the musicians themselves, making fun of every instrument and musician in the ensemble, as well as the compositional techniques of lesser composers. You really need to know what you are doing to write music that is this bad on purpose. The musical joke is a divertimento that was written for strings and 2 horns, an instrumentation that was typical at the time, and the instrumentation is about the only thing that is typical in this piece. The first thing that we hear in this work is a less than spectacular melody that is presented in a 7-bar phrase. Which for this era of music was highly unusual. Classical music was all about balance. 4- and 8-bar phrases were all the rage. When something was written in an unequal phrase length, it was usually used to show humor, so Mozart sets us up right away for what we should expect for the rest of the piece. Now remember when I said everyone gets a turn to be made fun of in this piece? Well, composers lesser to Mozart get to go first. Sonata form was the bread and butter of the classical era. Most major works, including almost all symphonies and concertos, included the sonata form in at least one of their movements. So it's safe to say that if you were going to be a successful composer in this time, you had to know the sonata form like the back of your hand. The incompetent composer that Mozart is trolling here clearly didn't study his forms carefully enough. He attempts the sonata form throughout the first movement, but it was a comedy of errors. The sonata form is broken into 3 parts: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. In a typical exposition, the primary theme is first stated in the key of the tonic, then there's a transition, and then the secondary theme is stated in another key, usually the dominant. Our inept composer starts with his uneven theme in the key of F, and then attempts his modulation by raising the 4th degree B flat to a B natural, implying that the dominant C major is coming. But then he goes back immediately to the B flat and finishes this transition again in the key of F. So there is no modulation at all. But at this point, our composer realizes his mistake and immediately goes into C major, creating a sense of confusion. The development section of the first movement is more awkward than it is wrong. Typically in the development, a composer will go through many keys and modulations and extend out ideas presented in the exposition. Here our composer's choice of keys is just strange. He starts in C, then moves down to B flat, and then down to A minor. But then he is unsure of what to do next, so he just goes right back up to B flat, and then back to C, and then quickly jumps back to F to start his recap section. The section overall feels too brief. He started to develop it and then took it back immediately, as if to just say never mind. During the recap, we typically want to hear the first primary theme again in the tonic, and then the second theme in the tonic as well, instead of the other key it was heard in during the exposition. So this raised leading tone shouldn't be here in the recap, and we probably shouldn't be ending the phrase squarely on the dominant if we want to be hearing the tonic. And then again, we jump quickly back to the tonic again, creating more confusion. It's as if our composer is just making it up as he goes along, without any pre-planning. The inept composers get several more jabs throughout the piece, especially in the fourth movement with the fugato section, but let's move on to Mozart's next target, the horns. The horns fall victim to the trolling several times throughout the piece. In the second movement, we get a passage where the horns are just straight up playing wrong notes that do not fit into the harmony at all. In the days of Mozart, horns could not play chromatically, at least not without some extended techniques. Valved systems had not yet been invented. Naturally, they could only play the harmonic series of the key that they were tuned in. A horn in C could only play these notes. If you wanted to play in other keys, you would need to attach a different length of tubing called crux that would open up a new harmonic series in the key you were looking for. To accommodate changing keys within a piece, sometimes horn players would be asked to change crux during the piece. And Mozart here is making fun of unprepared horn players that accidentally attached the wrong crux, which would produce notes that were completely alien to the key that they were in. But the horn mistreatment doesn't stop there. In the fourth movement, Mozart just sets these horns up to fail. Because of the nature of the natural horn, trills were no easy task. They could be done, but without valves, the technique required the use of the jaw and the lips rapidly moving back and forth. It was difficult and likely to be inconsistent over a longer trill, especially with lower-level horn players. And considering what he just did to them, obviously Mozart did not think much of these particular horn players. So what did Mozart do? He makes the two horns first do a 9-measure trill in unison, where any slip of intonation or timing would be immediately noticeable. And then he makes them do it again in extremes of registers 2 octaves apart. He deliberately makes it near impossible for this to sound good for them. In a past life, I played a little horn, but I had the luxury of valves. If anyone in the audience plays the natural horn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this section. The violinists, of course, get no mercy from Mozart either. The third movement is all about the violin. Throughout the movement, it's clear that the first violin is showing off his technical prowess, almost boasting with all of his trills and 30-second note runs. But that overconfidence is going to come back to haunt him. At the height of the cadenza, the shining moment of the violin solo, it all comes crashing down. As he reaches new heights on his fingerboard, he wanders into unfamiliar territory, accidentally modulating from a C major scale to a C-sharp whole tone scale, as he misses more and more notes on the way up. When he realizes how far off he has strayed, he plucks the open G string to reset himself, and then begins to trill on the wrong interval before rushing his ensemble back in to save him. Of course, about a century and a half later, whole tone scales began to be used in a serious context. Debussy is a good example, but here it was just to make fun of him. The cellos and basses seem to get mostly a free pass in this piece. They do get one nonsensical line, but that could be blamed on the composer. But of course, the most memed-on instrument was not going to get off scot-free. The viola gets its licks along with the rest of the players. In the 18th century, the viola didn't get much respect. I'm not sure that's changed. Just kidding. Most composers didn't write independent parts for it. Instead, they would usually just cross between doubling the cellos and the second violins without ever getting their chance in the spotlight. Mozart here gives the viola a solo line, but he writes it with strange voice leading that makes it sound awkward, almost like the viola screwed up its one chance at a solo. Irving Godt, who is a very large source for this video, gave his example of what he believes should be the correct notes in this instance, and it does sound less out of place than what is originally written. The The blame again could also be put on the inept composer for not knowing how to read the alto clef. Either way, it's pretty funny. In another section, the viola gets an extremely long trill, and this was Mozart paying homage to his recently deceased father, who once wrote that nothing is more ridiculous than a trill that goes on too long. So to Mozart, the maximum embarrassment he could give to the viola was to have them play this ridiculous trill. And finally here, the viola stopped counting and got a beat behind the rest of the ensemble, and then spent the next several measures trying to catch up. Clearly, Mozart was no stranger to viola jokes. And finally, for the finale, we get the punchline. Now that every instrument and bad composer has taken their lumps, we get the perfect ending to this disaster. As the players rush to the finish, wanting nothing more than to get this nightmare of a performance over with, they lose focus and forget what key they are in for the final few bars. The piece finishes in 5 keys at once. Ironically, the horns, who were the ones that were out of key earlier in the piece, are the only ones in the correct key now in F major, correcting their mistake from earlier. Everyone else just decides to pick a new key. The first violins finish in the key of G, the seconds finish in A, the viola finishes in E flat, and the cellos and basses finish in B flat, resulting in this polychord. Beautiful. This is one of the earliest examples of polytonality being used in music, and I couldn't think of a better ending to this piece. Mozart managed to troll everyone with this piece, and even though I couldn't find any first-hand reactions to the performance of it at the time, I can imagine that he got the reaction that he was looking for, out of both the crowd and the musicians he deemed to be musically incompetent. Nicknames such as the Farmer's Symphony and the Villager's Sextet have stood the test of time, so it's clear that everybody got the point. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe, and check out another video.